What's happening, Sonic Explorers? Trumpeter Bobby Spellman here, and today we're taking it out. We're gonna have some fun here. Typically, when we learn to improvise in the beginning of our improvisational journey in the jazz world, we're taught a bunch of so-called rules that enable us to be able to relate to the underlying form and the underlying chord changes in a way that is consonant and makes it sound like we know what we're doing. However, there are not really rules in jazz. There are simply stylistic conventions. If you play a wrong note or you decide to play something that is outside of that relationship to the underlying chord changes, the jazz police will not show up to take you, and you may indeed create a particularly interesting and emotive and evocative sound with your adventurous choices. So today I wanted to talk about different ways of approaching playing outside of the chord changes. Now, musicians have been doing this since the late 50s and into the 60s and maybe even beforehand, and it's become a part of the jazz vocabulary and a part of different styles of jazz and different styles of improvisation in any different style of music. So I figured that today we would start out with the most fundamental way of playing outside the changes, and that is to approach playing melodies in an atonal fashion on this episode of Theory with Bob. Despite the fact that great jazz musicians have been playing outside the changes for the better part of the last 70 or so years, this subject tends to be overlooked in the world of jazz education. However, in my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, there is a rich tradition of inside-outside playing that seems to have begun back in the day with musicians like George Russell and Jackie Byard, Cecil Taylor and Sam Rivers, and continues to this day with musicians like Jerry Bergonzi and bands like The Fringe. Now, growing up in that environment, I became very used to hearing the approach to being able to relate to the chord changes in a more abstract way. And a couple years ago, I had the opportunity to put together a class for the New England Conservatory High School Summer Program, the Jazz Lab, that dealt with some of these subjects. And I thought it'd be fun to put together a video that talked about some of the different approaches that you might use to play outside of the changes. When discussing different ways of playing outside the changes, I like to put these approaches into different categories based on the kinds of sounds that you're going for. Now, certain approaches may work better in certain circumstances than others, or these different approaches can be freely mixed and matched. All of the approaches and categories that I'm dealing with here have their roots for me in George Russell's Lydian chromatic concept, but because I have not yet put together my Lydian chromatic series at the filming of this particular video, I'll be discussing all of this in a fairly conventional theoretical framework. And I think that you'll be able to hear these different approaches to playing outside the changes and incorporate them into your own playing. So that being said, I wanted to start with what I think is the most fundamental approach to playing outside the changes, and that is atonality. I like to separate atonality in the beginning from pantonality to give a little bit of a contrast to what I'm talking about there. So when we're playing atonally, we're playing in such a way that we completely obliterate the sound of the tonic. So the melodies that we might play will just completely eliminate the sound of the tonic. It'll sound like you're floating in space. It's not clear where the tonic pitch is. This is in contrast to what I call pantonality, which is the idea that you're superimposing certain keys on top of other keys. So a melody or a part of a melody or a small phrase that you might play could be identified as in a particular key, but that key might be in contrast to the key or the chord of the underlying piece. So we're going to start with atonality, and there are different ways to approach atonality in order to be able to just obliterate the sound of the tonic and make it unclear what that fundamental tonic pitch is in the melody that you're playing. My favorite way to approach this in the beginning is chromatics. So if you're playing the chromatic scale, if you're moving around in half steps, that often really masks whatever the tonic pitch might possibly be. So if I'm playing a melody using primarily chromatics, it might sound something like this. Now, if I asked you to sing the tonic pitch that you got from that line, it may be rather difficult to be able to figure out exactly what the tonic is, what the root note of the scale that I'm playing is. With chromatics, you're using those small intervals to just be able to move around freely, and it really makes it hard to tell exactly what the tonic pitch is. Now, one famous example of this approach to playing outside the changes can be found on the Miles Davis Live at the Plug Nickel records from 1965. Miles uses a lot of chromatic approaches to be able to move around in such a way that it's not clear what the tonic pitch is and play outside and then back into the changes. Now, I got some friends together, and we went through and played through a blues, and I wanted to try some of these ideas out just to give you a demonstration of what that might sound like in a very controlled environment. So I'm going to show you that, and it sounds like this. All right, so you can see there what we're dealing with is a lot more than just connecting chord tones with chromatic passing tones. Rather, I'm trying to create melodies that use the chromatic scale in a way that totally obscures any tonic in the melody that I'm playing, and therefore creates a more abstract relationship to the underlying chords. What's cool about using the chromatic approach to atonal playing is that, as they say, you're only ever a half step away from a right note. So it's very easy to weave your way outside of the underlying chord changes and then safely land back in the chord changes as they are. Now, while we're talking about approaches to atonal playing, there's another way that you can create that obliteration of the tonic that I find very interesting and useful. And that is, instead of using the chromatic scale where you're dealing mostly in half steps, now you extend the intervals to such a wide degree that it obscures what that tonic of the melody that you were playing would be. So that might sound a little something like this. So, if you can sing the tonic pitch of the melody that I just played, you're a better man than I. One of my favorite musicians who employs this kind of approach to playing is, of course, Eric Dolphy. And Eric Dolphy would often be relating fairly directly to the chords that he's playing over, but because he was able to use these very wide intervals and these very interesting approaches, not only to intervals, but also to rhythm and to timbre, it really takes it outside of the underlying form that you're listening to. So we tried to give a little demonstration of a way that you can use this sort of approach to atonal playing while stretching out these intervals. And that sounds a little something like this. So there you have it, stretching out the intervals in such a way that it obscures the tonic of the melody that you're playing in relation to the underlying chord structure. Now, if you want to check out some really amazing recordings of the best versions of this, I think that you can find them on Eric Dolphy's own recordings, Out to Lunch, and others. And if you particularly want to check out his playing in a very tonal context, definitely check out Oliver Nelson's Blues and the Abstract Truth, and in particular Eric Dolphy's solo on Yearnin', which is just a great down-home swinging blues, and Eric Dolphy takes it into outer space in just an absolutely amazing way. The other great recording that I love is, or any of the recordings from the Mingus Band in around 1964. One of my favorites is Mingus at Cornell in 1964 with Eric Dolphy, where there are all these standard tunes that they're playing, things like Take the A Train and others, and Eric Dolphy has the opportunity to really stretch out and play some really interesting music on those tunes. All right, and that brings us to our third approach to playing atonally, and that is related to the earlier two, playing chromatically and playing with wider intervals, and that is to base your melody on particular interval structures. So, for example, one of my favorites is in playing fourths. If you can construct a melody that is primarily built of fourths, fourths have a tendency to obscure the underlying tonic. So in playing with a largely fourth-based melody, for example, and it's only one of many examples, you can really obscure the tonic and play inside and outside the changes freely. Now, this doesn't have to just be fourths. You could combine various intervals. You can combine fourths with minor seconds, with major sixths. I believe that Jerry Bergonzi has a book on that. If he does not, he definitely has a class on it at New England Conservatory that I took way back in the day. It was a lot of fun. But the principle is just that you're, instead of thinking in terms of the sort of underlying chord structure, you're thinking about building melodies based on particular intervallic structures. I'm going to try to do a little example of that right here, and then we'll play along with the great rhythm section. You'll hear what's going on here. So here's an example. So there I'm trying to use mostly fourths. I'm just playing around with it, but you'll be able to hear that more clearly, I think, within the context of the underlying chords on this example right now. All right, gang, and there you have it. 3 approaches to playing atonally in order to create a more abstract relationship between the melodies that you're improvising and the underlying chord changes. Big thanks to my wonderful rhythm section, Jesse Lynch on piano, Julian Smith on the bass, and Evan Hyde on the drums. We had a lot of fun playing through some of those different approaches to playing outside, and we hope that they were helpful in illustrating the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Also, be sure to go check out some amazing musicians who employ some of these different approaches to playing inside and outside the changes so that you can get a different example of different ways that musicians approach these techniques. All right, gang, I hope you had a lot of fun with that. Try some of these things out on your next jam session and see how they go. And I hope you have a wonderful time with this. On our next episode, we will be discussing different approaches to playing pantonally, which typically means dealing with different tonal centers superimposed on top of other tonal centers, and we're sure to have a lot of fun. So stick around for that. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya. Theory with Bob. All right, friends, thanks so much for checking out this video. We hope it helps in your quest for the majesty of musical self-expression. If you like what we're doing here, you can give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. And if you'd like to support the creation of new videos like this, you can become a subscriber on our Patreon page at patreon.com/Ridgewood School of Music. There, subscribers will have access to more in-depth follow-up videos, as well as solo transcriptions, various musical exercises, and all kinds of fun stuff. If you'd like to follow me on my musical adventures, you can find me on Instagram at Bob Spellman, and you can follow the Ridgewood School of Music's other social media pages by following the links in the description below. The Ridgewood School of Music is currently accepting new students online or in person in the New York City area. If you're interested in lessons, you can find us at www.ridgewoodschoolofmusic.com, or you can send us an email at ridgewoodschoolofmusic@gmail.com, and we can set you up with a great teacher for the instrument and the style of music that you're interested in studying. All right, gang, well, have a wonderful time practicing, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya.